So here's my logic, right? When you're starting and selling something online, especially pre-owned, people have and especially back then, people had the lowest expectation imaginable of you. They thought that everyone was a cowboy, everyone was a pirate, everyone was there to rip you off. It was guilty unless proven innocent, which was totally fair enough. Totally fair. So you had the advantage of the expectation being incredibly low. And so you could only positively surprise people by doing a decent job. And every single time when you added something that kind of cumulatively brought an additional level of trust or transparency, or at the very least some sort of value add, you pleasantly surprised them and you added something to the whole that made the whole better.
One of the reasons that I was very excited to sit with you is that I want to know, how did you even start ACM? And like, you usually further in the podcast we'll talk about like how you changed watch photography. I'm talking personally to me, like watch photography, articles, independent watchmaking, how to become you changed the way that let's say dealers or second market deals with passionate people. So how did you come ending up with ACM?
So when I started the business, and I have to sort of say from the outset, I was lucky. Very quickly, I had some really amazing people around me who supported the business, who worked with me, and some really talented people who joined the team. You know, came in, went out into the world, did other things. You know, some who stayed and helped us build it up to where it is today. At the outset, I think there were a couple of things. I always thought that it was interesting how much of a difference if we're talking about pre-owned things, first of all, what a difference it made just making a little bit of effort with photography. Just a little bit of effort, a little bit of lifestyle consideration, a little bit of effort also with descriptions when listing things, and a little bit of transparency when answering questions. And the way I learned that lesson was when I was 16, 17, 18. I'd occasionally buy and sell things on eBay, like a lot of people. And when I would resell things, I'd noticed that maybe I had the same thing that 5 other people were selling. And the only difference was that I wouldn't copy and paste the photos from the generic website where the original product photos existed. So I wasn't pretending to sell a new product. I wouldn't just take really quick, irritated photos with, you know, whatever the technology was then, slap them up and not bother to crop or not make any effort for lighting. I would try and compose things. I would try and place them in the center of the image. I would try to make sure that the medium, the context in which they were situated didn't distract from what I was trying to highlight. And I tried to make sure that it was comprehensive. I wouldn't overdo it, but I tried to have 6 to 8 photos that were decent. Now, I'm no photographer, and for the record, I've never ever taken any of the photos on the website, just like I don't write the articles. I review the articles, I've been involved from day one, but we have very talented people who are much smarter than I am writing the articles and doing the initial research. Just like we have super talented photographers who take the images that you know, now we sort of become more associated with. But the fundamentals remain the same, which are, if you don't make the effort to present something well, you almost don't deserve to be able to succeed in selling the thing that you're looking to sell. And it's almost like a respect for the consumer. I know it sounds silly. I know it sounds very pretentious. But if you don't respect the person that you're trying to convince that they should purchase the thing that you're selling over somebody else's, it's obvious. And in so doing, I think that the only person that you're disadvantaging is yourself. If you're disingenuous and insincere in the way you present things, then it comes across very quickly, especially if you don't respond to questions and your information is partial. And so I just figured that out when I was about 16, 17, 18 on eBay. I noticed that I would sell my thing for the same price or more to 5 other people or 4 other people selling the identical same thing, just because I made an effort. And in my brain somewhere that sort of made a lot of sense, because I knew that I was exactly the same. And I think somewhere along the way that connected when I started to get into watches, and then when I started the business as it was then, it was called Watch Exchange, terrible name back in the day. Everything sort of revolved around that idea. Try and be as transparent as possible in the information that you provide, and reassuring as possible, because trust is everything, but try and equally make an enjoyable ecosystem, so that there's a certain pleasure in reading the descriptions and in going through the photos. Why? Because I know that when I'm excited about something I want to buy, after I bought it, I will go back 5 or 6 times in the 4 or 5 days whilst I'm waiting for it, and go through the description and look at the photos in anticipation, and I can relate to that.
Oh, nice. But what did you do before ICM?
So I was at law school in London and Paris for 4 years. I was at UCL in London, and then I was at Paris de Pontoise in Paris for a year. And then I came back to London. I worked in a law firm as a paralegal for a year. Gosh, that was quite a long time ago. And then I went to business school in Paris. I went back to Paris to business school, to HEC. And then when I finished my master's there, I came back. I briefly interned in a private equity fund in London, and I was in a team called Deal Origination, which basically was reading all of these interesting business plans that were being submitted for management teams that were interested in potentially doing management buyouts of the company, sitting in on interviews to see, whether these people had the potential to be successful or not, and whether they were going to be backed by the fund. And I learned a huge amount in a short space of time there, because I realized that any business can be interesting. Any business can be, exciting and stimulating to be interested in, if the people are exciting, if the idea is original and there's a passion. So there were people who were selling, garden railings for large industrial companies across the country, making large apartment blocks, and how on earth could anyone ever find that interesting? Yeah. Well, you'd sit down with these people and they were genuinely passionate about what they did. Yeah. And I think that passion is the thing that you spot most consistently in impressive businesses. So when there's a genuine passion for what you do, because you can't fake it. You can't fake it. And over time, you can try, but over time, it multiplies. And people are subconsciously attracted to passion, I think, in engagement. And so through that experience, I built on what I learned at business school. I got excited about the idea of starting a company. I just started to sort of get into watches at the time, so things sort of coincided. And I just sort of, I got a sense that if you were excited about something, you should probably just go after it and see what happens. And that's what happened to me.
So what was the thing that made you, let me try? Like, what was the first watch you took photo of? I mean, like how did you even start? Like, sitting in the living room saying, I'm going to start a pre-owned website? So, how did you source the first watch? Do you remember the first watch?
I do. I remember everything about that experience. So, well, it actually, I was having a conversation with my dad over a coffee in my kitchen. I was still doing my internship as part of my master's, and I had interviews for some consulting firms. I had an interview for potentially working for a VC fund at a very junior level. And I just remember speaking to him about how I wasn't particularly motivated by any of those prospects. And then I just explained to him how I tried to sell a watch, a completely a classic Cartier tank that I'd bought my first paycheck when I was like 21 or 22 or something like that. And for various reasons, I was looking to sell it. And the experience was just so underwhelming. I mean, it was a £1,000, £2,000 watch in those days, and it was a quartz movement. I didn't know anything about mechanical watchmaking at the time. But I remember I looked on eBay. I went to Bonhams. I had no idea how this world operated. I looked and spoke to sort of mum and pop, sort of smaller watch reseller sort of boutiques, let's say. And it was all just quite painful. It was all quite painful. And eventually I ended up selling it on eBay, and that took months, and they ended up like double checking and triple checking everything and holding the money. And I was as straightforward as possible. And I was very, I wasn't trying to con anyone. And yet the whole process was painfully difficult. And so I just remember sort of like sharing this experience with my dad and saying, I think I have this funny feeling that there's, look at how social media is evolving. Back then, 2013, 14, still relatively early days of Instagram. I think you had Watch Anish and a few others, but there wasn't, and Hadinki, of course, but there wasn't it wasn't what it is today. And I just thought to myself, it's interesting, these pre-owned goods, traditionally people think to themselves, I have to see them in person, like as if I'm ever going to buy something secondhand without physically inspecting it first, which then makes it an extremely localized market. But I just thought this doesn't quite sit with what I know about, for example, American consumers. American consumers are much more comfortable with a little bit of risk because they feel like they have the safety protection, through their credit card companies and things like that in the background, and you can just sue someone if something goes wrong, which is fair enough. And so I remember all these things sort of like coming together in my mind, and I thought, I wonder if there's a way to potentially sell secondhand luxury watches online, but there was Watchfinder doing things, and it wasn't really the bit of the market I was interested in. And sort of like, to make a long story short, I explored this, wrote a business plan, took 6 months, 5 months to write a business, 5 months off, spent several months just working on this business plan, pitched it to a really important watch collector that I knew in London, who was into independent watchmaking. And he and several other people, including my dad, to be honest, really supported me. Like, they were genuinely very supportive. And I started off on a very low risk basis. I was shooting things in my apartment, in my front room, sort of like convincing friends who were, amateur or professional photographers to just give us a hand. I remember the first shoot, in order to get the website live the next day, because I had committed to this hard deadline and postponed it multiple times, and I couldn't move it again. I remember we shot all night to get the first photos up of the first watches, which, by the way, I think the first watch I ever sold was 10 years ago, an IWC Portuguesa, I think it was. There was a time when everybody wanted those, and they were just, and you could do arbitrage. You could do arbitrage. You could buy them in Europe for X, and you could sell them in the UK for Y. And yeah, so that's how it started. But things changed very quickly. Within a year, things changed.
But you had a business plan.
Yeah.
You had, okay.
It was the best thing I ever did. The 4 or 5 months I spent basically just working whilst I was finishing my internship, and 1 month that I had off at the end, I worked all my day on my own for weeks upon end with great satisfaction, building a massive model, which in the end became irrelevant. But the intellectual exercise was useful.
But how much of it did you change, actually? Because usually
completely and totally irrelevant. Yeah. Literally from day, but that's the thing. I think with all business ideas, they start somewhere, but you can be pretty sure that within 6 months, a lot of the stuff will have just been jettisoned. But that flexibility in the early days is, I think, the key. Being able to sort of adapt to change, and also not being. We talked about passion, but when you're starting a business, I think you have to strike a balance. You can be passionate about your project, but you also have to be a little bit dispassionate about the practical reality of how you manage things. Because if you get too emotionally attached to something, to an outcome, it can bias your behavior in an unhealthy way. And so, I was always very kind of like realpolitik about things. It was, you've got to find a way to at every single moment, as far as possible, especially in the early days, adjust according to the context that you find yourself in. So, if something doesn't work, change it, move on. If you see an opportunity over there, Go and investigate. If someone is upset with you, don't be upset with them. Try and figure out why they're upset with you, and try and, adapt, and if necessary, apologize. As soon as if you've made a mistake, have the humility to process that in the right kind of way and apologize and try and do something to make up for it. And I think all those things in the early days were very important.
And back in the early days, did you ever thought about, like, if you look at a collected man right now, so can you divide it up in, like, so you have the media side, let's say, now, mashallah, you're retailers, let's say, right? Authorized retailers for one of the biggest brands when it comes to independent, and then you have the articles, or you can combine it as a media. Sure. Was that planned from day one? Is that no watch exchange, writing articles, doing amazing photography, visiting watchmakers, different cities around the world?
Someone that I like a lot said to me many years ago, Hodinkee started in content and ended up selling watches, and you guys started selling watches and you sort of moved into content. And I sort of like, it was predictable that you'd kind of end up in the middle. I was very flattered by the comparison, but it wasn't, it sort of just happened naturally because, so here's my logic, right? When you're starting and selling something online, especially pre-owned, people have and especially back then, people had the lowest expectation imaginable of you. They thought that everyone was a cowboy, everyone was a pirate, everyone was there to rip you off. It was guilty unless proven innocent, which was totally fair enough. Totally fair. So you had the advantage of the expectation being incredibly low. And so you could only positively surprise people by doing a decent job. And every single time when you added something that kind of cumulatively brought an additional level of trust or transparency, or at the very least some sort of value add, you pleasantly surprised them and you added something to the whole that made the whole better. And I think that was the advantage. And so did we start off thinking, we'll do this and then we'll do that and then we'll do it? Not necessarily. If anything, I would say that I would expected us to have done more by now. But the reality is, and we were talking about it just before we started this, consistency is key. And so first of all, I wanted to make sure that we had, once we had the basic essentials of watches to sell and a platform and so forth, we needed to have consistently good photography, and it needed to kind of keep going up and up and up in quality as far as possible. We needed to have consistently well-written, informative descriptions that are akin to good catalog descriptions from our friends at Philips and others. We needed to make sure that the customer service, in as far as you possibly can, with the limited capacity that you have of being a smaller team, is as high as possible. And we so as we went along, we figured out what we could do well. We decided where we needed to prioritize. We made some mistakes, for sure. There were areas where we went too far, pulled back, and so forth. But overall, we tried to be deliberate in all the things we did. And so you asked whether we can separate the different parts of the business today. My view is that in the long term, everything is amalgamating. Everything is becoming homogenized in a good way, not a bad way. There will be no such thing, in my opinion, in the future as a media company or a retail platform or a pre-owned business or a primary, watch authorized retailer or a video producer. Everything. There will always be specialists, of course, don't get me wrong, but ultimately I think that everything is sort of merging and blending, and I'm very excited to see what that looks like, because I think that websites, for example, of the future, you won't necessarily have a journal or a blog separated from content, separated from products. So, and I'm not saying that in a bad way. I don't mean that everything will be blended in a way where you can't tell the difference between, things that are being sold and things that are being written about. I just mean that it won't be so deliberate. It will be more organic. It'll be more fluid. There'll be a natural, there will be just an ecosystem that sort of, in my mind, is more naturally harmonious, where there will be interesting bits of content alongside interesting things for sale, and then maybe interesting bits of content from outside your website. It will be a different kind of world, and there'll be video. So we haven't got there yet, and maybe we're a few years away, but in the end, much like the primary and the secondary market for me in the end are going to merge, because collectors are looking at the big picture and they're saying to themselves, well, I want the best collection of X or Y. and 90% of what's available to me now today is already been made and is already for sale on, I have to buy it at auction or on the secondary market. If I'm going to want to really achieve a world-class collection, I have to have a pragmatic approach that reflects that distribution across the market, and I have to be willing to buy secondhand or vintage as well as brand new, and sort of getting that mix, that combination right for me will be the key. So in my mind, everything is going to become more sort of organically mixed, I would say.
Actually, I have a question about the last part you mentioned, is that if you look 10 years ago, pre-owned market wasn't always looked down on, right? Even if you come to this culture, so we have certain words, like if you say a dealer, there's always a negative thing to it.
For sure. I hate the word.
Yeah. So actually, I have a question before we start a bit. And if you
look over my shoulder, I'm like,
and if you look at, but what I'm noticing now, even if you go to Watches and Wonders, if you go to I Am Watch, whatever, you always see Alex from Philips. You would actually see, I don't know what, like, how do you like to present yourself?
So, terminology aside, because I was there when it was different, I understand entirely where those preconceptions come from. I completely understand. I remember, my impression of secondhand watch dealers when I came into this was like secondhand cars salesman, which is probably unfair to secondhand car salesmen. I'm expressing a prejudice about another thing, and I'm like saying, I don't want to be, please don't be prejudiced against us. But I get it. I totally get it, because all markets essentially start off very unsophisticated, and then as success and money becomes more present, and as things grow, more sophisticated operators enter a market, and more investment comes into the market, and the combination of all those things results in a positive change in development. Today, I feel like the pre-owned, second-hand luxury watch market is radically different to the way it was 10 years ago, not just in my country, but it's a global market today. And the value of things that are comfortably sold on the secondhand market is radically higher. So to give you an instance, for instance, when I did my business plan, I remember tracking the average transaction value for 10 years, let's say, yearly average transaction value of watches sold on Watchfinder. And back in 2014, 2015, I think when they first started, it was under £1,000 in year one. And then by the time I launched my business in 2014, it was like £5,500, £6,000. And Watchfinder was considered the sort of the gold standard to be acquired by Richemont and, et cetera, et cetera. That was the comfort level, because it was online, because it was commoditized, because that's where the volume of transactions existed, et cetera, et cetera. Then Chrono 24 emerged, and that also disrupted things in a positive way. And then, my thinking was, what's the thing that stops someone spending £100,000 or £200,000 comfortably at a distance? So someone's in America and we're in London, say. Trust. Trust is the determining factor if someone feels comfortable or not. And actually, you can build up trust relatively quickly, just like you can lose it in an instant. But if people trust you, if they believe that what you're selling is real, if they believe that if they have any problems, they can genuinely have those problems resolved to their satisfaction afterwards, if they don't think that there's a risk that you're, selling stolen goods, or that you're them buying something from you will later cause them problems, and that the experience ultimately will be smooth and positive for them, then you can sell anyone anything at any value. And actually, that's the truth. The clients that have spent the most money with us historically on important pieces have been people that either we hadn't met before they'd bought quite a few watches already, or only met after several years, and so the difference between back then and today, I think, is that back then there was just no information, there was no transparency, it felt very localized. there was pessimism, which is
but
natural.
Also, what you did, and big part of the trust is the knowledge and the content that you mixed in.
Yeah.
To me, this is very important. Like if you look at like culturally here, it's different in Kuwait, but you would go to a pre-owned watch shop and you saw 70% of them are Rolexes, and then if you ask any question, nobody would answer. Like, yeah, this is a Parmigiani which sells for $2,000 and retails for 20, but nobody knows about it.
Yeah.
But when you guys started, and then a couple of other websites, is that when I come to a collected man, I know I'm buying from a knowledgeable person.
Thank you.
And I know based on the content you produce, you're not selling anything. So the whole mantra, the whole thing that I'm seeing in front of me changed everything. The same with auctions. And to me, honestly, is the same. So the reason why I said the negative thing is that if even in Kuwait, so when we do, let's say we do a VIP dinner, and let's say there's I don't know what you want to call it, a guy who owns a pre-owned shop.
Yep.
He's a really good collector. Nobody would invite him, which saddens me, because they would look at him. Yeah, but he's a dealer.
Yeah, for sure.
But like, he's really passionate about it. So that's the difference. When you look at ACM, you see all of this back end and say, you know what?
Sure.
Yes. You end up sitting with the best collectors. You end up traveling everywhere because of this knowledge and background.
Yeah.
And this is what you guys did for the market.
I appreciate that. And I get that. I think that there is a certain amount of social exclusion, probably historically, with those who operate in the new market versus those who operate in the pre-owned market, or those who are collectors versus, everybody wanted to be able to buy those things and have a person they could have a relationship with, but they didn't want to have a relationship with them. They didn't want to have a friendship. And I think that's just the human nature. And I think all you need for that to change is for time and sophistication and for trust to build. And so, I think that when you go to the trouble of, so many people have said to me over the years, why on earth would you share some of the stuff that you've shared in collector's guides, for example? You're basically sort of giving away information that's valuable to those on the transaction side of the equation when wanting to accumulate things at a lower value and to then sell them at a higher value. So you're kind of you're
teaching them.
You're sort of you're kind of, what's the word? You're disadvantaging your own. And I said, well, I don't see it that way. First of all, I don't see us as X or Y. I very much see it increasingly as sort of like an amalgam of things. I see us as, I don't see us as dealers. I've never seen us as dealers. In fact, I haven't seen us as dealers for years and years, actually. But I don't in any way fail to understand why other people use that terminology and see us that way. But what I think is that the more information you share that's of quality, the better the ultimate functioning of the market. And that's the advantage to everyone. The more information of quality that you share with people, with collectors, the more likely they are as a secondary benefit to trust you, for sure. And they're going to understand that you're authentically passionate, which I think is important. But ultimately, you're adding to the sum of knowledge in the market. You're making it more efficient. An efficient market is a more successful market, a more dynamic market, less responsive to shock, more able to sort of like adjust according to changes in outside context. So for me, the more information you share, the better, the quicker the market becomes better. And fundamentally, it doesn't change the fact that, if your core business is finding special things, most people, most of the time, don't have the time to be able to dedicate to doing that. So there's always going to be a value placed upon that service of someone being able to source and supply special things, whether they're new or secondhand, with the combination of a good relationship and trust, and it being done in a manner that's enjoyable. And if you do all that, you raise the bar. And if you raise the bar, everybody wins, because everyone then has to sort of like move towards a higher standard.
And I said that a couple of times. You raised the bar for you guys and everyone in the market.
So did they. So did Philips, the auction house for the auction world for watches. And I think that the more we can do that, the better things are for everybody.
So mixing these two words, how to you, like your personal take, why do you think ACM became an official retail for Akrevia, Bedant? But like these watches, like, you know, very easy to sell. You don't even need a retailer. But when I saw that you have a whole section, and I think you announced 2 years ago, maybe, I don't remember honestly.
So we started working with Rejab and Akrevia 8 years ago.
Okay, that explains a lot.
So
Okay.
8 years ago, I was introduced by a mutual friend to Rejab. I went to see him in his workshop on the, I think it was Avenue Krieg. And in those days, and Rejab was very transparent about this, you know, it was a very different market. It was much harder to, independents were not prospering like they are today.
Not at all.
Younger independents struggled more than older independents because they didn't have the sort of the pre-existing data in their market and the established network and relationships of clients through the forums and stuff, collectors. And so, you know, in those days, it was, you know, Akrivias weren't selling like they are today. Rejab didn't have the reputation that he deserved to have, that he has today. But we were always passionate about it. And I've never pretended about this. You know, the reality is actually relative to the amount of time and capital that you allocate for new watches, the return on investment is significantly lower than on the pre-owned side, because on the pre-owned side, you sell a watch, and if you're any good at what you buy, you then recycle that capital several times over in a year or whatever period of time. But again, it goes back to the passion. I wanted us to work with Akrivia and Rejab. Why? Because having had the experience of being in the independent market for 10 years and having been, you know, working with Roger Smith and Philippe Dufour and Kari Voutilainen in a meaningful way before anyone else was, I understood, I felt, I sensed the fundamental dynamics was the same there. Rejab was passionate and talented and determined in a way that I'd not seen in any other young watchmaker at that time. And so my gut feeling viscerally was that this is a person to follow. This is a person to work with. This is a person to sort of get excited about and work and be supportive of. It doesn't mean that I had a crystal ball. I don't want to suggest, because it's very easy after, you know, to write history afterwards. I've been very fortunate. We've been very fortunate as ACM to be able to work with him. And I think it's been a really fruitful collaborative relationship. But from that experience, which was born of a desire to be supportive and to participate in something more interesting than simply arbitrage of pre-owned goods, and translate some of that passion into something else, from that we were able to work with Peter Mbeda, we were able to work with Sylvain Pinault, we were able to work with Bernhard Schwintz of Vinyl, and we have Raoul Pages, for example, and then we have lots of other partnerships coming through over the next year or two. And it all sort of connects and makes sense because, again, clients are not interested in just buying pre-owned or primary. They're interested in building collections. They're interested in storytelling, and they're interested in completing things. Yeah. And so you want to be able to help them find all the key bits of those stories. And actually, some of that is new. Some of that is secondhand.
And why are you attracted to independent watchmaking?
Well, I mean, I think the reality is that the diversity of talent and the diversity of expression of art form and high craft in independent watchmaking is only found in independent watchmaking. Like in the world of horology, there is absolutely a place for all different types of brands and all different types of products according to where you sit, whether it's a micro brand, whether it's a grand complication, grande petite sonnerie. There are all so many different interesting strata and levels of sort of creative expression. But the bit that appeals to me most has always been the bit that I would say is the most artistic, the bit that's the most creative, the bit that involves the most proximate connection to a person making the thing. And I think that storytelling dimension, the emotion, the passion, and the ability to have an interaction with someone, often on a one-to-one level, all of it combined with the sort of the variety of mechanical watchmaking that you find in independent watchmaking in particular, all of that stuff just naturally attracted me, and also attracts my team and my colleagues. You know, everyone is shares in that passion to varying degrees and in different ways, but cumulatively we're all pretty much pulling in the same direction, which I think works well.
So the human side of it.
Yeah, very much the human side.
The human side
Yeah.
of it. And like, okay, during the years, if you look at the bigger brands,
Yeah.
they all started as small independents or a few watchmakers gathering, Patek
Yeah.
Philippe or Vacheron or whoever.
Yeah.
So when do you see, even when I look, and I was just looking through the articles you guys do, I notice you go back to the golden age of a certain brands.
Yeah.
And we're going to mention a few brands. One of them is Roger Dubuis.
Yeah.
I remember, I think you were heavily, my memory is not that great, so I see a lot of things, but I remember a period that you were very heavily into Roger Dubuis.
Yeah, for sure.
And when you see them, it's like there's two feelings. One is, I'm really sad what's happening right now,
Mm-hmm.
and I love these previous years.
Mm-hmm.
And like, in your own personal view, when do you feel that a brand starts disconnecting, or like, because if again, if Philip Dufour, for God forbid, in a few years, like how can his daughter or the brand itself keep this one message, the human side of it, in the future?
So it's a very good question. I think it's case by case, probably. I think that, you know, you talked about Roger Dubuis. Early Roger Dubuis was incredible. The early homage chronographs, the condottieri, all these amazing things that came out of that one manufacture were the product of a creative genius, a mechanical and creative genius. And I think that, you know, we take it for granted today, but rare is the combination of good design taste and mechanical talent. Often you have great mechanical watchmaking, but maybe the dial design or the case design doesn't match the mechanics. Sometimes the opposite is true. And then missing on top of that could be business. And so it's very hard for a brand to prosper, right? So early Roger Dubuis was successful because it had some really amazing fine watchmaking in the form of a lot of the 3-to-1 Emmanuel-based movements that were beautifully finished. I think Poinçon de Genève, I think, really high quality case making, sort of Tasti-Tondi type pushers, everything about some of those early watches for me is a sort of a box ticking exercise of all the best things you can do when producing a watch, and called an homage. Today we look back and we think, oh, look how original. Back then some people said, well, it's an homage to early Patek. It was basically his passion for that. In terms of how you can sort of, I think it's important to be able to look beyond the noise, right? And to really be able to be successful in collecting anything, you have to be able to look beyond the noise. Sometimes that literally means appreciating the underappreciated and trying to understand whether something tangibly or intangibly has greater value by your definition of value than it then is reflected in its price or its position in the market. And that sounds very sort of quantitative, but it's actually very qualitative. Sometimes it's like, well, that feels like it's more special than it's appreciated to be by most people today. And so trying to refine that sense and that instinct for the sort of like the quality of things and looking for them in places where you might not otherwise find them, I think brings you to interesting things. We were interested. I remember Daniel Roth, years ago, I was thinking, God, those weird case shapes. I remember thinking, I'll never wear one of those. And then at some point, 5 years in, 6 years in, my brain matured, my experience, whatever it was. And suddenly I started looking at the early Piguet movements, that were being used in some cases by Daniel Roth in his, Epsilon Curve X time only watches and stuff, ultra slim time only watches. I'm thinking, this is like amazing. And then I'd wear one on the wrist and I'd be like, this is better. And it was just so strange because I had this moment of like, I could almost like look at Silas of like 4 years ago, and he would have been like disgusted. And then like there I was thinking, what's wrong with me? And it taught me a valuable lesson. It's like, try as much as possible to remove the sort of the glasses that you wear when you look at things that are sort of shaped and informed by what other people tell you is good or cool. Try and figure it out for yourself, and try and understand at a fundamental base level what it is that makes something special, so that you can then see patterns elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. But it takes time. So if you like, I wasn't into watches, let's say back when we used to do these watches. But back in the days, was he successful?
I think so. I wasn't either, unfortunately. But I think that often what happens is there's a huge spike in success because these watches wouldn't exist today if he hadn't been successful. So very often these brands had ascendancy because they were right place, right time, and right product. And then they had decline because they didn't maintain that momentum, because at a certain point the product changed, or the vibe changed, or the culture changed in the brand, and they just sort of had like a period of progressive decline, and suddenly the people who were being targeted at day one were radically different at day 100 or year 5 or whatever it is. So I don't think that most of the people who are targeted today by many of those brands, and I don't want to single out Rajbi because there are lots of brands in similar situations, they're not the same people that were targeting today, and not the same as the people who were targeted back then. So brands change.
Yeah, and I truly think it's really, really hard to keep doing things like creativity. It's 100%. Very difficult.
Yeah.
And
well, I think that the truth is, with success comes laziness at times, and that's human nature. I try not to be too harsh about it, because the reality is, there but for the grace of God goes anyone. We could all find ourselves suddenly deciding, oh, you know what, God, it's been a long year, right? Time for a long break, and actually I'm not going to focus on what happens next year or the year after, whatever. But the reality is that if you lose that passion, you should get out. Like if you can't find the motivation to keep doing things at a high level because you genuinely don't find it as exciting or interesting, or you can't find that excitement and interest somewhere in what you do, stop. Just stop, because inevitably it's going to decline and other people will suffer for it. So the same, I think, is true with brands, and you can see it when certain watchmakers leave their brands, eponymous brands.
Do you want to mention names?
No, but you see it. I mean, whether
few comes to mind, but
of course, and when they pass away, that's just a thing that happens, and to all of us. In other situations, some watchmakers, have not had the recognition financially, let's say, in their lifetime, for what they created and contributed to the world of watch collecting, let alone the market. And therefore, you can't help but feel a degree of understanding and sympathy for their disappointment or frustration, that collectors, of course, have benefited hugely from the appreciation of value if they've sold their watches that they bought new, but the watchmakers haven't. But again, such is life. Such is life. It's not always fair. The market isn't always fair. Also, watchmakers don't always do themselves a favor in the way they sort of like think about the future. And equally, we can, if we look at history and we look at artists, actually many artists were completely unrecognized in their lifetime, only to be recognized at the very end of their career or after they died. And it's sort of like, well, how do you find the right balance? You mentioned earlier, I think, how rare it is for brands to be able to maintain a consistent appeal. I would say good examples of that in independent watchmaking are at a sort of bigger level are MBMF and F. Pigeon. Max is still as passionate and as obsessed today, as you know, as he was, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. You know, that man hasn't changed. If anything, he's become more passionate, more determined,
more hard on himself.
And you know, and Jean is consistent. You know, there is he you can tell, whatever you feel about Jean the man, he doesn't get out of bed in the morning to make money. He's successful, and that's a byproduct of his talent and his discipline and his investment over decades into his brand. But he is clearly sincerely and authentically motivated by his passion for watchmaking and his desire to constantly prove himself. And he's very competitive, I'm sure.
He is.
He's very competitive. And so, you know, but that's okay. I'm a very competitive person, and you just have to figure out how to balance that in a healthy way so that it doesn't handicap you at times. And I think success speaks for itself with Jean, just like it does with Max, just like it does with others.
Yeah. But if you look also at the small new independents, they had success much earlier. Like if you take Peterman. Beda.
Yeah, for sure. Peterman, Beda, Gaël and Florian.
Amazing watch. But this, like, the first edition was done
100%. Yeah.
And if you go back to Philippe Dufour, remember his story is traveling everywhere just to sell a single watch.
100%.
So that would change it. That affects you on a personal level. At the end, they're humans, you know.
100%. So every generation that comes is the net beneficiary of what's come before them. You know, in effect, they stand on the shoulders of giants. And that's not their fault. Just like it's no one's fault that they're born poor, born rich, born, you know, you make the most of what you have in the context in which you have it. And actually, I always say to people, I'm always more disappointed in people who have a lot and don't make the most of it than people in the opposite situation. Or rather, I think that I'm a harsher critical judge of people in those situations than I am people who have had little opportunity succeed, and if they've succeeded, even more impressively so. So Philippe Dufour, George Daniels, Daniel Roth, Roger Dubuis, you know, that whole generation opened the door for independent watchmaking. They did the hard yards. They suffered and fought in the trenches. They sacrificed. You know, not in any sort of like philanthropic, you know, desire, but they definitely cared about the survival of fine watchmaking in La Vallée de Joux, for example. And from that came, you know, the beneficiaries of that included Roger Smith, Kari Voutilainen, you know, Max Busser and Uwe, and that sort of that second wave of independence, who then came in and had a very tough time too. You know, most of these brands, you know, either lost money or broke even only after a long period of time. And many of them didn't even prosper until really 2018, 2019, 2020, COVID and so forth. So they were the second wave. And now, and I would say Recep actually is more in that second wave with them because he started 12 years ago. Right, and it was really tough in those days. I mean, you know, he will tell you stories where, you know, he really did have to choose between having 3 meals a day and or like being able to do X or Y because it was a choice. And then you've had the third wave, which includes my very talented friends Gaël and Florian, and includes others who actually worked for independent watchmakers back in the day, but didn't have the circumstance, fortune, money, or perhaps even the confidence to start their own brands back then, that have now been able to do so. And they have the scars of that market, but they also have the lessons, and they benefit from the fact that now social media, you can communicate easily with consumers, you can present your own brand. Spotify, you can build your own website, you know, affordably. It's much cheaper to buy a camera and to do half decent photos now with AI and all that jazz. So you then have this third wave, and you're going to get more waves, and the frequency of the waves is going to increase, and there's going to be more and more talent coming through. But as I think Alex Gottby said when he spoke to you recently, you know, the reality is that the many won't succeed, many won't prosper. But again, that's normal. In art, not all artists are successful. Only a very small number are truly successful. In all markets, actually, most companies fail when they start off. Very few grow to a point of prosperity. And so but the world is richer for it. The market is richer for it. Independent watchmaking is richer for it. And new things will come. Yes, there will be some homogeneity at times. Everyone will make a round 3-hand simple watch that's finely finished. I agree with Alex in that regard. But there will be a reaction to that. And I'm already seeing that reaction. You can see the fatigue amongst consumers and collectors to things that are too familiar. Just like, by the way, the main reason I think that independent watchmaking prospered so much during COVID and around that time was not just because it was COVID, but because people were bored of the same things from the big brands, and they were looking for authentic ways to differentiate themselves and to support smaller businesses, brands run by individuals that they could talk to, and they were interested in perhaps having more of a role in the determination of the watchmaking. And I think that that has that then encouraged people to sort of look for the more niche. And then I think, again, collectors now are going to be responding to a feeling that perhaps there's too much similarity between certain types of products being released by independent watchmakers, particularly the newer generations, and they'll reward those who come up with original ideas, and they will prosper, and then the market will continue to bifurcate and stratify. And so I fundamentally believe in the organic dynamic of the watch collecting market, the watch market, because in the end, quality rises to the top.
And if you can list 5 underrated watchmakers.
that's I get that question. Sometimes people ask me for one, and I find it hard.
I mentioned 5.
Are we talking from history, or are we talking about from today that are very new?
Let's say today, like. Yeah.
I mean, it's hard because the market, because I think things have naturally sort of developed such that broadly speaking, most watchmakers find their own level. It's terrible. I can't remember the names of the gentlemen, but there are 2 chaps in Germany who produced a watch that I think was recently nominated for GPHG. I don't know if they won the watch, but my colleagues were showing it to me, and you'll have to check what the name is. I'll check the name. Germany, outside of Lange and to an extent other brands in that sort of Glashütte basin, you don't really hear that much about independent watchmaking in Germany. But like these, it's gonna bother me that I can't think of their names. But there are these 2 chaps who are making very high quality watches, I think, for very reasonable prices, but they're quite young and they're starting on their journey, relatively speaking. In historical terms, in the pre-owned market, I still think early Parmigiani is underrated. I think the quality of the watchmaking with early Parmigiani is really very, very high. We've already seen early Daniel Roth appreciate and Roger Dubuis appreciate. It's sort of, there are probably less places to hide today, which is probably why the new generation are even more interesting, because a lot of the sort of the unexplored recesses of the market of pieces that have been made historically have already been explored, I would say. So people are more familiar. But there are so many cool guys coming through. Some of them haven't launched yet, so I can't really talk about them, unfortunately. But I'm super optimistic. I'm trying to think what else. I mean, people may disagree with me on this, and I respect their opinion. But I would say actually today, Philippe Dufour watches are undervalued on the pre-owned market relative to where they were. If you think about, they were selling for $1 million. A Simplicity was $1 million 2 years ago. Now a Simplicity is $500,000. And actually, I would say that the pressure on that market is slightly artificial. When there is I won't at all talk about details, but when there's an emotional dimension to why people perceive something to be worth less than it is, that is often detached from the fundamental, tangible, qualitative aspects of the watchmaking. And I would say that creates an undervalued situation, because the emotional aspect will pass. The emotional aspect will always pass. I've seen it constantly happen over the years. So then it just goes back to the fundamental quality of the watchmaking. The finishing on a Philippe Dufour simplicity, especially those made by his own hand, is second to none. The importance of that man's role in the market is very hard to understate. When he was making the Grande Petite Sonnerie, for example, that genuinely was an exceptionally impressive accomplishment to miniaturize something that only existed in pocket form watch before, and then to build it in-house and develop and finish it the way he did. I mean, he told me once when we sold our Grande Petite Sonnerie a few years ago, he said that I think I pretty much sweated and cried and bled in making those first few watches. It was so stressful. It was so painful. And the same is true for dualities. A duality today sells for $1.7 million or something like that at Philips. It would be disingenuous for me to not say that we also have a piece at a similar price. Those watches were selling for $4 million 2, 3, 4 years ago. Again, that the value has been pulled down slightly by an emotional a feeling that collectors have, that I understand at times vis-a-vis the brand, but the tangible value of the watchmaking and the rarity of the watchmaking is very high. And I would say that there's an imbalance. So it might be harder today to spot an undiscovered or completely unappreciated or underrated watchmaking brand, but it's easier to point to other parts that are more mature, where there is currently an artificial level of underappreciation that I think in the long term will be not supported, and that prices, they won't maybe go back to where they were. That is just market dynamics, and probably they won't for a long time if they ever do. But I suspect they will go back up to some extent, because the quality and scarcity relative to the price still feels slightly in imbalance.
It's very important for me to ask these questions. It's just I like to explore things that it wasn't on my mind. Actually, I want to ask you about the Philippe Dufour thing. So I understand now the market is much softer than it used to be.
But only relative to a couple of years ago, not relative to 4 or 5 years ago.
That's also the answer I always get from Alex. That's the answer I get from everyone else.
Yeah. Which is the truest answer.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember Philippe Dufour, this first simplicity. We were, people don't know this, but we sold the very first simplicity to ever appeared on the pre-owned market. Watches had traded on forums between collectors. It wasn't a transaction. They'd exchange messages, and then there was no transparency. You have no idea if it sold, what price, etc. And I think I have a funny feeling there had not been a simplicity at auction by 2015. I think there hadn't been. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure there hadn't been. There had been Grande Petite Sonnerie, and there had been, I think, a duality by that point. Maybe not a duality, but in any case, strangely, there hadn't been simplicity to my knowledge. And so I remember the first time we got one. I've told this story a few times. I remember messaging someone very, very, very knowledgeable in the market, still very knowledgeable in the market today. And I quoted a price, and I just collected the watch in London, and I was on my way to see someone else who I thought might potentially be interested. But before I went to see them, I wanted to check with a third person, because they'd talked to me about it before. They'd already asked, like they had like an option, let's say. And so I messaged them, and I told them the price, and they said, nah, this isn't worth more than £90,000, let's say. When the seller is prepared to lower their price, please give me a call. I said, fair enough. I was saying the price was 120,000, I think, and I thought, God, have I got this wrong? And I was suddenly, I was filled with self-doubt. And my taxi arrived. I got out. I went and saw the person that I had in mind. They saw the watch. They instantly said yes. The watch sold for 120,000, and then the next one we had 3 or 4 months later sold for 150,000, and then 6 months passed, and we were fortunate to have another one, and that was 180,000. And we always tried to do it sort of incrementally. We didn't want to do massive jumps. We wanted to just test the market and see what the response was. And I think that, I remember what that was like. The only thing that changed was then pieces would come up at auction after that market had been established and there were more transparent price data points so that people felt reassured. An auction then came along and the price went up by 100,000 as opposed to 20,000. You lose control. And I think that then becomes a little bit dangerous because you lose the ability to influence the pricing of the market because thereafter nobody wants you to list their watch for less than the auction price.
That's it, yeah.
So you are, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place because on the one hand it's great that the market is organically produced to price, but auction results sometimes are the product of right person, right time, right weather, the stars aligned in the sky, whatever it may be, the right couple of people were bidding. And sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. But broadly speaking, the market continued to be quite consistent, and the prices were going up, and there had to be multiple parties participating for that to happen. And then you got to a level where many of those who had collected Future 4 in the early days had sold or were never going to sell. It was one of the two other... So then constraints of supply happened, and that's when you kind of hit the sort of the zenith of like $1 million plus. And it coincided with the independent marketing probably being like just as it started to get really popular, let's say 3-4 years ago. And then as soon as those who had bought the watches at higher prices decided they wanted to sell, which happens for all sorts of reasons, perfectly legitimately, their expectations are high in terms of price, obviously, but the kind of like sudden result of that is there are multiple pieces on the market at once, and that then sort of often coincides with a going down of the price. And then obviously 2 years ago we had war in Ukraine starting, or a bit more than 2 years ago, war in Ukraine, inflation rising, correction in the crypto market, all sorts of other things. Okay. And I think that then resulted in a sort of a correction, not just with Future 4, but in other big brands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, like, personally, if you talk about Philip DeFore or even other, like Roger Smith still, is that I think they, on a personal level, they got to a level that they're not a watch to wear anymore. Yeah. Like if you spend 1.2 million on
100%,
and they become art.
Sure.
It basically it completes a collection.
Sure.
Becomes part of a collector's journey and such.
Yeah. No, totally.
Yeah.
But I think also then the kind of the way you enjoy it changes. And so maybe you don't wear it every day, but you wear it on special occasions. You wear it on your birthday. You wear it at your daughter's wedding. Yeah. You wear it, when you're on holiday somewhere where you feel comfortable. You wear it to a special meeting or a special dinner. You take a calculated risk in the same way that, there are important pieces of art in private collections that don't get enjoyed in 99% of like situations. They're not in the living room, they're not in a hallway, they're behind a piece of bulletproof glass in a secure office or something, and that person has a moment to be able to really enjoy that when they want to. It's under their control, but they just have to be a little bit more cautious and risk averse. And I think that's the nature of the collectible market. When things go beyond a certain level of affordability, a portable good like a watch then becomes a less portable good. Yeah, exactly. And maybe we're less aware of it with art because they're stationary objects, and so you can put them in a secure environment and they can live there. Whereas with a watch, of course, you may not be able to take it to all the places you want it to. But Kuwait is a very safe country. There are lots of very safe spaces. I think Singapore, is a good example where people feel comfortable wearing very expensive things, out and about. That's just down to personal judgment and discretion. I think that most of the time when you're outside, it's always better to sort of choose what you're wearing according to your comfort level of exposure. Mm-hmm. And if it's very special, probably wear a cuff.
Yeah, true. So let me ask you the other question is that I saw your collaboration with Baltic. Can we talk about these one of the things that I felt happened also with the social media, everything, we have a lot of micro brands.
Yeah.
Which are very fun for a guy who likes watches and passionate about. You cannot have a Philippe Dufour, but you can have something simple from a certain brand. You cannot have an MBNF, but you can have Space One. You can have other brands. Yeah. What brands that you have in mind that you really appreciate when it comes to micro brands?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are so many of them today that are emerging, and that's like the flora. That's the flora. Is that the right word? That's the wonderful byproduct of a developing and maturing market that now brings more and more people into watchmaking and exposes them to watchmaking in a way that they previously wouldn't have been. And to some extent there's a credit to the Apple Watch for getting a certain generation of people used to having a piece of real estate on their wrist. I always agreed with Jean-Claude Biver when he talked about that. I really thought that was one of his most perceptive observations, and Jean-Claude Biver has made many perceptive observations over the years. But I think that today we have this real wealth of young, interesting people. Not even young. I mean, like there are lots of interesting people all around. So, on the one hand, I have my former colleague Matteo Violet-Vinello, who launched Anoma, and I couldn't be happier for him.
It's beautiful.
He's a really smart guy, and he's created something really nice, and he deserves success. And I'm really glad that exists in the world, because I think it brings something to watchmaking. You have friends. I'm good friends with Phil Toledano in America, Toledano and Chan. He's taken this, would you term it brutalist? I suppose kind of brutalist interpretation of watchmaking inspired by architecture, and it very much is a reflection of his taste. You can see that this is both he and his partner, Chan, created something original that allowed people to enjoy something, that's flavored in his kind of taste and in his world. And I think that's at an affordable price, relatively speaking.
The one similar to the Midas or something, right?
So they had the lapis lazuli dial, they had the meteorite dial. There's one coming up.
The misshaped kind of watch.
Exactly. Inspired by a window of a famous art gallery. I can't remember which one it was. I don't think it's the Met.
Okay.
Anyway,
just wanted to make sure that it's the same brand. Yeah.
And obviously Baltic and Full and Mari. Two brands that I think have done a huge amount to move that market forward, and Space One, I think is very cool too. And I'm trying to think, there are lots of interesting things happening, at that level on the market, and it's great because it gives people an opportunity to participate either where they couldn't economically participate at a higher level, or quite simply to be able to have choices. Today I wear my Baltic, tomorrow I wear my Grand Comte Patek, according to what I'm doing. And actually, I always say this to people, and they're surprised. When we sold out of the Baltic, we had a small number of pieces in reserve, let's say 10 pieces, just in case. The demand for those pieces came almost entirely from our biggest clients, absolutely our biggest clients. They were like, I didn't realize I was traveling. I was on I was on the other side of the world. I had no idea this was happening. Parenthesis, why didn't you tell me? Is there any way of getting one? And it was just flattering. It was fun. And I'm glad we did it.
That's the interesting thing to me. If you take the micro brands that we're crazy about, they always sell out and they do pre-orders, and you just show them to the normal, regular people who into watches, they would say it's either ugly, or they don't understand it.
Yeah.
And I think this is a very important gap that the micro brands filled.
Yeah.
And if you look at it, even as a timekeeper thing, is like we have Burns from China. And I have a question later on. Is like Burns is the same. So I love what MBNF does. I want something that's different. I don't want the regular 3-hand or complication. These brands come in at a very good competitive price. But the question is, when does it come as a knockoff? When do you feel this brand is basically copying a Crash, copying 240 from Patek, or copying something certain?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky because homage has always been part of watchmaking, and not just watchmaking, but also other things like car collecting. we pay tribute through our choices to, in some cases, to people or to things or to events that have happened in the past that we admire, that we want to connect to in some way. And I don't think there's anything fundamentally wrong with doing that. I just think that, you know, it's a very nuanced, hard to answer question, but sometimes you can feel if something is derivative or if it's tributary, if it's paying, you can just sense what side of the line it's on. If it feels like instinctively almost all of the raison d'etre of this thing is essentially down to it copying something else that existed and passing off, you know, the legal term passing off. If you are essentially trying to con people into thinking that they are buying something else or that they are getting essentially the same thing for a cheaper price, that is bad. That isn't great, you know, unless it stimulates competition and stimulates, you know, the person who did the original thing to do better. When it's inspired by iconic design language that we can all admire and that we are all happy to see in places, whether it's classic vintage Patek or, you know, something else like the Cartier Crash, you know, it sort of when it's done in a tasteful way that feels like it's you know, a sort of a respectful, you know, a wink or a doffing of the cap, you know, in a direction that says thank you, you know, Gerald Genter, what you've contributed to watchmaking design is of exceptionally great importance, and I want to recognize the inspiration that you've been to me in my journey when I created something, and so there is a bit of this that I attribute to you in the sort of design code of the X product. That's great. When it's like just a copy and paste, it's not so great. You know, there are lots of people who I think have done an amazing job. You know, Berneron, for example. I didn't appreciate, I think, what he did fully until a year or two passed. And I initially was thinking, oh, well, this, you know, I love the Crash and there's elements of this that remind me of the Crash. And somehow I kind of like, I couldn't see the woods for the trees. But then afterwards I sat back and reflected upon it, you know, over a couple of years almost. And because he very kindly showed me the product before he launched. And now I realized that I was wrong. And that's good. You know, sometimes you have to second guess your emotional reaction to things and say, am I being fair or am I biased because I have a particular feeling about something else and it's clouding my judgment. So, you know, I suppose my point is, even if instinctively you have a sense of whether something is an homage versus derivative in an unhealthy way, actually, sometimes you even need to take a step back and ask yourself, am I being fair? Because then you might miss something really special, which occasionally happens.
Yeah, true. And honestly, to me also, I look at the full package.
Yeah.
So it's the design, the movement, the finishing, the whole thing that goes behind the brand. So I know it took a lot of your time, and I have other plans to do here in Kuwait. I want to take you back to ACM and the vintage world.
Yeah.
To me personally, I have two questions that actually came from Hamad.
Oh, yeah.
Rajassim. So the first question about the vintage, which is very difficult for me, and also, and I told Alex that, and I told, when I go to Philips and pay 20% extra on the price, is that I'm buying the effort I'm buying the condition, everything else, but at least I got it from an auction. It's not like another brand. It's the same with ACM. Yeah. So my question is, when it comes to vintage and the condition, so, and that's Mohammed's question, is that sometimes when the watch itself is over polished or damaged, adds value to it. Damaged, not over polished, let's say. And sometimes if it's like new, it's also another selling point and add values to it. Yeah. So when can we see, like, how can we value a watch condition?
Yeah. So I should say at the top of this that I'm not a vintage expert. It's been quite a few years since we've done vintage watchmaking, vintage, since we've sold vintage watches in the sort of like in the meaningful sense. And so I always explain to people, we're not, I don't consider us to be a vintage watch business. However, I think my answer doesn't change. It's very contextual. So sometimes provenance comes in the form of physical things, and sometimes provenance comes in the form of invisible things. When, a watch has been worn in space, or by a famous actor, or by a famous race car driver, the damage, quote unquote, to the case or to the crystal or to some aspect of the watch is a physical authenticator of that provenance and a tangible connector to that story. When you put your finger over it and you know that X or Y, Steve McQueen or Buzz Aldrin, whoever it may be, knocked that, as they were doing, this or that. that makes it tangibly real in a way that goes beyond simply the characteristics of the watch. And that explains why sometimes watches that don't even look that good because they've been restored by someone badly 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but have exceptionally important history, sell for a premium. In other cases, I think that it comes down to the same thing, which is authenticity and trust. If something doesn't feel authentic because it's been made to look like it's brand new, but in a fake way, it's such a tricky question. We were talking with Mohammed yesterday about, how the vintage car market is different, right? The vintage car market, actually good restoration is generally speaking priced at a premium. In watches, it's considered fakery, and it's the opposite. I can't tell you, somehow people want the best of both worlds. They want the very, very best examples possible, which is a natural human instinct, but they don't want them to look like they came out of the factory yesterday. So they kind of want their cake and eat it. And therefore that naturally dictates what sells at a real premium, i.e. the exceptionally special sells at a real premium. The problem is that, of course, people who are minded to take advantage of that desire and that premium will then be motivated to artificially and maliciously simulate that and tell you that it's something else. And we come back to the idea of passing off that we talked about earlier. You're trying to pass off something as genuine that's not genuine, or in a material way is not genuine relative to the bits that you care about. So I think the barriers to entry into vintage watch collecting today, sadly, are as high as they possibly could be, because you're not just trying to find something rare. You're not just trying to find a barnyard, barnyard find or whatever, something undiscovered for 20, 30 years, 40 years. You're also fighting against the highly sophisticated operators in certain parts of the market who are creating things to making things look better than they are, or making them look in a way that they shouldn't be. So then you have to rely upon expertise and so forth, and you have to invest a lot of time and effort into finding special things. Personally, I think that's why certain parts of the vintage watch market have cooled down, because at a certain point it was unsustainable with all those things going on. It didn't feel healthy, and I think people get fatigue. I think that some of the biggest collectors who are now in independent watchmaking today and in Patek and Lange and other things come from the vintage watch market because they just got bored. They got bored of having to constantly try and fight the fight. Now that means that there is less competition, and you can find the really special stuff, which means that there's undervalue. I have a vintage Rolex. I don't have any other Rolex, but I have a vintage Submariner that I love because it feels like a really cool watch. It's a watch that I wanted 10 years ago. It's my summer watch. Boy, it's from 1965 or something, or 67. No, actually, is it earlier? Anyway, it's an early watch, but at that price point, actually, it feels incredibly good value for money. I don't worry about it. I don't stress about it. I know it's well designed and made, so I can have it more or less waterproof when I travel and all these different things. So that creates opportunity for people like me who just want the thing for genuine pleasure. But the result is, unfortunately, there's a sort of like a situation where, well, actually, no. One of the valuable positive byproducts of that is that people then look for more interesting things at the periphery of the market. So neo-vintage has risen as a market. True. Why? Because of two things. First of all, trying to explore the undervalued at price points that were more accessible, where the risk level was lower, and where the servicing issues were basically the same as a new watch, more or less. It wasn't such a headache. True. That neo-vintage has prospered because people still wanted some vintage vibe, but they wanted it at a accessible price point with an opportunity to differentiate themselves from everybody else, because not everyone was wearing, a cool APQP 5 years ago in a round case. People didn't appreciate the importance of that watch in the survival of the brand, things like that. And equally, they just didn't want the headache if something went wrong, because they knew they could send it to the brand and it could probably be serviced more or less without them changing the thing that made it special. But again, the negative has created an opportunity for those who want to go to the trouble of trying to find the real deal. And there are amazing vintage watch dealers out there who have levels of knowledge and credibility that put them in a privileged position to be able to advise on things. As a result, people like Adam Mentor, like he gave me great advice. He's a really good guy. There are many others like him. Good opportunity. Yeah. When the market's sort of like correcting.
So one of the things that we didn't talk about is your personal collection.
Yeah.
We're going to mention 2 or 3 watches. I know you're not wearing a watch.
Yeah.
I was thinking, I was at home, I was like, what should I wear to the interview? I just put this on and left.
Yeah. So
you mentioned the,
Yeah. So I've collected lots of things over the years. My first Patek was a 3940 white gold, early piece from I think 89 or 88. I've had the good fortune of kind of, being able to flavor all parts, taste all parts of the market. I had a first series Royal Oak, A series. I had Green Dial Reverso, London Boutique Edition. I've had like a really cool platinum Star Wheel, and then I've had indies. I've had the benefit of collecting lots of interesting things over the years. I'm actually in a phase now where I'm trying to sort of temper my appetite, because I have 3 or 4 really interesting things coming next year that I'm really excited about. Some of them I've been waiting for a long time, and then I've my name down for a few other bigger things in the next few years after that. And I'm just trying to almost, it's like a diet. I'm trying to get myself to a place where my collection is as modest as possible. I'm also at a phase of life now where I'm looking to buy a house in London. I'm settling down, maybe thinking of starting a family, and I'm just trying to plan what the next 2 to 3 years looks like with my commitments and the various things that I'm doing, and I'm trying to adjust. I think that most likely much of what I collect in the future will be commissioned watches from independent watchmakers, but there will be 1 or 2 sort of exceptions to that. But I'm super excited. Some of the brands haven't been launched yet, so I can't really, unfortunately, talk about that, which is why I'm being a little bit
completely
ambiguous.
New brands, completely new.
Yeah. People starting, or in some cases, just watches that haven't been launched yet.
That's a nice position to be in. Huh?
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I'm 100% conscious of what a privileged position I'm in. I think it's one of the most amazing things of unexpected gifts of being in this market and doing what I do and doing what we do and being around for 10 years is I tell people I'm the accidental watch collector. I didn't start off with the ambitions of being a big watch collector. I was passionate about watches and I was passionate about the market. I just happened to be exposed to some amazing things over the years, and that has stimulated in me an interest and a passion that has meant that actually I couldn't live without those things in my life. They're too important to me. So today I'm very, very, very conscious of and extremely grateful for the exposure I've had to so many interesting people, to Roger, to Rechep, to some of the young guys coming through, to Philippe, to even to Jean, to the education that has provided me with in terms of understanding the nuances and the discrepancies and the sort of like the differences as distributed across the market is exceptional. And as a result of that, I'm in a position to be able to appreciate what I have much more than I've ever been. And I think that's the biggest gift I've got from all this. That and the people, you know, to be quite frank.
One last question. I'm sorry for keeping
please.
you here. To people or to the query market, to this region, let's say more, can you explain ACM in short? Like, how can we sell? How can we buy from you guys? Sure. Consignment and such.
So Collective Man today is an increasingly independent watchmaking specialized business. We sell pre-owned and we sell new. But we operate much like an auction house. Most of the time we consign. So we act as agent on behalf of clients wanting to sell pieces. And then we equally work with clients that we've known for a long time in building their collections. And so we don't source. So rarely will we, have a request from someone, can you go find this for me and we'll do it. In fact, I think we've almost never done that in our history. But what we do is we say, look, let's have a relationship. Let's get to know each other. Let's understand where you're coming from. It doesn't matter if today there isn't a transaction, but if you are meaningfully, seriously interested in building an important collection, then we can help you and advise you on how to do that. And most of the time, that will be in offering you things when they come through that we think make sense, and in some cases helping you sell things in your collection that don't mean as much to you anymore. It's a sort of multifaceted service, mm-hmm. and also it's professional. We don't want people to think that we're trying to be their best friends. We're not trying to create a dynamic that's artificial. We want it to be based on respect, mutual respect, professionalism, and a genuine desire to understand each other. And so the best relationships we have today with some of the most exceptional collectors in the world, for which we're tremendously grateful, are relationships that just feel very organic, that are based on a real understanding of what we can do best and how we can help and what they're really looking for. And it's based on trust, and it's based on a shared appreciation of each other's time, and it's based on longevity. Our best clients have stayed with us, some of them for almost 10 years, and they have kept coming back, and we've kept developing that relationship because we've been able to maintain consistency, and they've always been fair, and they recognize that there is a genuine value that is reflected in the service that we provide when we help them do what they want to do best.
Amazing. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been really fun.
I really hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Kuwait.
I will. The welcome has been amazing, and this is my third trip, and I look forward to coming back, hopefully many times again.
Inshallah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ali.